A carton of toddler milk sat alone on the checkout belt. Just one carton, small and blue, the kind with a picture of a smiling cartoon cow on the front. But the whole evening of a young mother seemed to be balanced on top of it. Renee Coleman stood there with her daughter propped on her hip, staring at the little red numbers on the register screen like they might change if she looked at them long enough. She had counted the cash in her coat pocket twice before she ever left her apartment. She already knew she was short. She came anyway because sometimes hope is the only thing left in a person's pocket, and you spend it even when you know the math will not work out. 2 lanes over, a man in a plain charcoal jacket stood pretending to read the label on a jar of pasta sauce he had no intention of buying. He was holding the hand of a girl of about 8, who was swinging their joined arms slowly back and forth, humming a song from a cartoon. The man was not looking at the sauce. He was watching the young mother. He did not know her name yet. He only knew the particular way her shoulders dropped when the cashier said the total out loud, and the particular way she pulled the little carton of milk back across the belt toward herself before quietly asking to leave it behind. He had seen that exact motion before in a different store in a different year on a woman he used to know better than anyone in the world. What happened in the next 90 seconds would pull 2 strangers into the middle of a truth that neither one of them saw coming. A truth that had actually been waiting almost 80 years to be discovered. Before we get into how it unfolded, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and what you think that man is about to do. If you have not already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this is one of those stories you are going to want to see all the way through to the very end. Now let us go back to the beginning of that evening, to an ordinary grocery store on an ordinary Thursday, the kind of evening nobody in that building would have remembered, if not for what happened next. Nobody in that store paid Renee Coleman any attention that night, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Under the buzzing white lights of the Fairview Market on the east side of Cleveland, she stood in the checkout line with her 1-year-old daughter balanced against her chest, one arm hooked underneath the little girl's legs, the other hand gripping a thin plastic shopping basket. Renee was 26 years old. For the past 4 years she had worked as a housekeeper at a downtown hotel, cleaning 30 rooms a shift, changing sheets, scrubbing bathtubs, learning to move through other people's messes so quietly that most guests never even noticed she had been in the room at all. She carried herself the same way through the rest of her life too. Quiet, careful, trying very hard to take up as little space as possible, so that nothing bad would notice her and decide to make itself worse. Her daughter Zoe had just turned 13 months old, with a head of soft curls and a laugh that could turn heads across a whole restaurant. But Zoe also had a severe dairy allergy, discovered the hard way, after 2 frightening trips to the emergency room in her first 6 months of life. The pediatrician had been very clear. Zoe could only tolerate one specific brand of hypoallergenic toddler milk, a specialty formula that most regular grocery stores barely stocked, and that cost nearly 4 times what a normal carton of milk would cost. On a housekeeper's wage, that single carton was not a small grocery item. It was a decision Renee had to make every single week, weighed against rent, against the electric bill, against gas for the old sedan that got her to work and back. She had done the math 3 times sitting on the edge of her bed that afternoon before ever leaving the apartment. She knew she would be short. She told herself maybe there would be a discount she had forgotten about, maybe the total would somehow land differently than the numbers in her head, maybe this once the universe would bend a little in her direction. It did not. Her basket held the cheapest things she could find: a bag of rice, a dozen eggs, a small tub of plain yogurt, 2 jars of baby food, and the blue carton of specialty toddler milk that Zoe needed in order to not end up back in a hospital bed with tubes taped to her tiny arm. The cashier, a tired-looking young man named Curtis, scanned each item with a steady, mechanical beep that did not care who was standing in front of him or what any of it meant to her. The total landed at $31.40. Renee opened her wallet and her fingers for just a second trembled as she counted out $24. Every bill she had left until her next paycheck landed in 3 days. "I am so sorry," she said quietly, not quite meeting the eyes of the woman waiting behind her. "I need to put one thing back." She slid the carton of milk gently across the belt toward Curtis, careful not to let her hands shake too visibly, careful to keep her face as calm and unreadable as she could manage. Behind her, a woman in a business coat sighed loudly and rolled her cart back a few extra inches, the wheels grinding against the tile like a small, cold verdict on the whole scene. Renee felt her face go hot. She wished, in that moment, that the floor could simply open beneath her sneakers and let her disappear quietly into the basement of the building, away from every set of eyes that might be watching. A few feet away, near the shelf of specialty pasta sauces, a tall man in a charcoal jacket had been watching the entire thing unfold, and had been watching, in fact, since Renee first walked into the aisle 5 minutes earlier. Nobody in the Fairview market that night had any idea who he was. Dressed simply, without a single visible logo or watch that screamed money, he looked like any ordinary father doing the evening shopping with his daughter. But the man was Malcolm Reeves, founder and chief executive of a logistics and supply chain software company called Union Crest Technologies, a company he had built out of a 2-bedroom rental apartment 14 years earlier, and had since grown into a firm valued at well over $2 billion. He was 44 years old, and he was there that evening only because his niece Harper, 8 years old, had begged him to stop for the good strawberries that this particular store carried and nowhere else nearby. Harper was not technically his daughter. 3 years earlier, Malcolm's younger sister Diane had died suddenly in a car accident on an icy stretch of highway just outside the city, and Malcolm, without a single moment of hesitation, had become the only family Harper had left. He had rearranged an entire company around a little girl's bedtime and her nightmares and her school pickup schedule, and he had never once regretted it, though there were nights, quiet ones, long after Harper had fallen asleep, when the grief still crept back into the empty rooms of his enormous house and reminded him how much he had lost in exchange for how much he had gained. Malcolm had watched Renee Coleman for several minutes before she ever reached the register. He had noticed the way her eyes moved across each item in her basket, doing silent arithmetic. He had noticed the practiced, careful way she balanced her daughter on her hip, as though holding the child close was the only thing keeping her own body upright. Malcolm had seen poverty statistics before, of course. He signed enormous checks to charitable causes every single year, numbers with more zeros than most people would see in a lifetime. But those had always been figures on a spreadsheet, abstractions handled by his foundation staff. He had never stood this close to it, never watched shame play out in real time on the face of a mother forced to choose, in front of strangers, between her pride and her child's needs. "Uncle Malcolm," Harper whispered, tugging gently on his sleeve. "Why did that lady give the milk back?" Malcolm looked down at his niece's small, open, honest face, and found he did not have an easy answer for her. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that some mothers in this country have to choose between paying the electric bill and buying the one specific thing their child's body can safely digest? "She is just having a hard evening, sweetheart," he finally said, keeping his voice low and even. He watched Renee finish paying for the rest of her groceries, watched her shoulders curve forward under the weight of a single thin plastic bag, watched her walk toward the exit with her head down, moving the way people move when they have spent years practicing how to be invisible in a world that has grown used to looking straight through them. In that exact moment, standing near a shelf of pasta sauce he would never buy, Malcolm Reeves made a decision. He was not entirely sure at first why it mattered so much to him. He only knew with a strange, certain pull somewhere behind his ribs that he could not simply let this woman disappear into the parking lot as though nothing had happened. He crouched down to Harper's eye level. "Sweetheart," he said, "I need you to stand right here with the nice security guard for just a minute." Harper nodded and took the guard's outstretched hand without protest, already distracted by a display of balloons near the front doors. Malcolm walked back to the register with a clear sense of purpose now guiding every step. He picked up the carton of toddler milk that Curtis had already set aside to be returned to the shelf. Then he moved quickly through the store, gathering a rotisserie chicken still warm from the case, a bag of apples, a loaf of good bread, a small container of the same brand of yogurt he had seen in her basket, and almost as an afterthought, a box of animal crackers shaped like little zoo creatures. He paid in cash, thanked Curtis, and stepped out through the automatic doors into the cold evening air, his eyes already scanning the parking lot for a woman carrying far more weight than a single grocery bag should ever hold. He found her at the bus stop at the edge of the lot, sitting on a cold metal bench under a flickering street lamp, her daughter asleep now against her shoulder, the thin plastic grocery bag resting between her sneakers. She looked impossibly small out there in the dark, wide parking lot, a single point of stillness surrounded by the slow crawl of headlights pulling in and out. Malcolm approached carefully, deliberately slowing his steps so as not to startle her. Excuse me, he said, his voice quieter and gentler than he had planned. Renee looked up sharply, her whole body tensing, one arm instinctively curling tighter around her sleeping daughter as she took in the sight of a tall, well-dressed stranger standing over her holding 2 full grocery bags. I think you left this behind, Malcolm said, holding out the bag with the carton of milk visible near the top. Renee stared at it for a long moment, and then a fresh wave of humiliation rolled through her chest. I did not forget it, she said carefully, her voice quiet but firm. I could not afford it tonight. I know, Malcolm answered gently. So I bought it for you. Renee went completely still. For several seconds no words came. She searched his face for the thing she had learned to expect from strangers who noticed her, some flicker of pity, some quiet judgment dressed up as kindness. She did not find it. What she found instead was something closer to plain, uncomplicated concern. I cannot take that from you, she finally said, her pride rising up like the only shield she had left standing after a long day of small defeats. Please, Malcolm said. It is only milk. Your daughter should have it. His eyes drifted briefly to the sleeping child on her shoulder. How old is she? 13 months, Renee answered before she could stop herself. Her name is Zoe. Zoe, Malcolm repeated softly, and something in his expression shifted, warmed. I have a daughter too, more or less. Her name is Harper. She is 8. He held the bag out again. Please. Think of it as one parent helping another. Nothing more than that. Renee hesitated, her pride wrestling silently with the fierce, exhausted love she carried for her daughter every single hour of every single day. Zoe needed that milk. It was not really a choice at all, not when she looked at it honestly. Her eyes filled without her permission, and she reached out and finally took the bag from his hands. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly around the words. I do not even know how to thank a stranger for something like this. You do not have to, Malcolm said. But it is getting cold and this bus can take a long while on a weeknight. Would you let me drive you home? My car is parked just across the lot. Renee's eyes widened. Milk was one thing. Climbing into a stranger's car in the dark was something else entirely. Oh no, I could not, she said, already shaking her head. The bus will be here soon enough. I insist, Malcolm said, his voice gentle but not backing down. At least let me carry the other bag for you while we wait, so your arms can rest. Before she could argue further, he had already crouched down and lifted the heavier bag from beside her feet, his fingers brushing briefly against hers as he did. She looked at him properly for the first time then, past the expensive but understated coat, and noticed the tired lines carved around otherwise kind eyes, a deep and private sadness his easy smile did not quite manage to hide. It felt, in a strange way, like stepping into someone else's dream. She let him lead her across the lot toward a dark sedan waiting near the edge of the lights, nothing flashy about it, but clearly unmistakably expensive, with a driver stepping out to open the rear door before either of them had even reached the car. Inside, the world changed completely. Warm air. The soft smell of leather. A silence so total it felt like its own kind of luxury. Malcolm went and collected Harper from the security guard, and the little girl climbed into the car chattering happily about balloons, glancing curiously at Renee and the sleeping baby beside her. Harper, this is Miss Coleman, Malcolm said. She and her daughter are going to ride home with us tonight. Hello, Harper said shyly, waving one small hand. Hello, Renee answered, and for the first time all evening, something that resembled a real smile crossed her face. The drive across the city to Renee's apartment building was quiet, but it was not an uncomfortable quiet. Malcolm asked for the address and she gave it, feeling a small twist of shame as she pictured her aging, water-stained building in a neighborhood a man like him had probably never once had a reason to drive through in his life. He did not react at all. He simply repeated the address to the driver and turned back to playing a gentle guessing game with Harper about which animal she was thinking of. Renee watched the two of them together and saw a real deep bond running between the father figure and the little girl, something warm and unmistakable. But she also noticed, underneath it, a loneliness in Malcolm's eyes that she recognized immediately, because she carried around a version of it herself every single day. When the car finally pulled up outside her building, a squat 3-story brick complex with a cracked concrete stoop, Malcolm insisted on carrying the groceries all the way up. You have already done more than enough, Renee protested weakly. I can manage from here. I am sure you can, Malcolm said, a small smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "But I would like to help anyway if you will let me." He followed her up 2 flights of dim, narrow stairs, past a flickering hallway light and the mingled smell of old carpet and someone's dinner cooking behind a neighboring door, a world entirely different from the hushed leather quiet of his car. When they reached her apartment at the end of the hall, Renee dug through her bag for her keys with hands that were still trembling slightly, painfully aware of the peeling paint on her own front door and the worn, faded welcome mat beneath their feet. At last the door swung open, and a happy squeal rose up from the small living room. A neighbor who had been watching Zoe's older cousin, a toddler named Marcus who was really the son of Renee's sister, stood up from the couch with the boy on her hip. "Marcus is doing great," the neighbor said, gathering her things quickly, clearly eager to head home for the night. Renee thanked her, walked her out, and turned back to find Malcolm standing quietly near the doorway, taking in the small, sparse, spotless apartment, the neat row of children's books borrowed from the library, a single framed photograph propped on a bookshelf beside a chipped ceramic vase. It was a home with very little in it, but every corner of it was clean, cared for, loved. "This is Zoe," Renee said softly, adjusting her still sleeping daughter in her arms. "She is perfect," Malcolm said, and he meant it completely. His eyes drifted, almost without meaning to, toward the framed photograph on the shelf. An old black and white picture of a young woman in worker's coveralls, standing in front of a factory gate, a fierce, steady look in her eyes even through the faded print. "Who is that?" he asked, nodding toward it, more out of politeness than real curiosity. "My great-grandmother," Renee said. "Ruth Coleman. She worked in a steel mill here in Cleveland during the war, back when they needed women to fill in for the men who had gone overseas. I never met her, but my grandmother used to tell me stories about her all the time. She said Ruth was the toughest woman anybody in that mill ever knew." Malcolm smiled politely, filed the small detail away without much thought, and said his goodbyes, promising Harper they would stop for real ice cream on the way home as a reward for her patience. As the car pulled away from the curb a few minutes later, a strange, unfamiliar warmth had settled into Malcolm's chest, something that felt, against all odds, a little bit like hope. He had no idea, not yet, that the photograph on that shelf and the name Ruth Coleman were about to unravel a piece of his own family's history that had been sitting quietly, unspoken, for almost 80 years. The days that followed felt different to Renee. The heavy gray fog that usually sat over her mornings seemed to have thinned, just slightly, replaced by a small, stubborn warmth that had nothing to do with the groceries she had been given and everything to do with a simpler truth. Someone had actually seen her. In a world that had trained her slowly over years to expect to be overlooked, a total stranger had looked directly at her and recognized a human being standing there. Not a problem, not an inconvenience, just a tired mother doing her very best. That evening, after putting Zoe down for the night, Renee sat alone at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her, staring at the framed photograph of her great-grandmother Ruth. She thought about the man from the store, Malcolm, and about his daughter Harper, and wondered whether she would ever see either of them again, a single bright flash across an otherwise dark stretch of her life. But something about that evening had done more than fill her refrigerator for a week. It had cracked open a door in her chest that she had shut a long time ago, a door behind which sat every dream she had once had for herself, before Zoe, before the hotel job, before survival had become a full-time occupation that left no room for anything extra. For months, Renee had been living inside the same narrow loop. Wake, feed Zoe, drop her at daycare, work an 8-hour shift on her knees scrubbing other people's bathrooms, pick her up, cook, clean, sleep, repeat. There had been no space left over for wanting more. But now a small, fragile thought began to take root somewhere deep inside her. She deserved more than this. Zoe deserved more than this. She thought of her great-grandmother Ruth, a woman who had walked into a steel mill full of men who did not want her there and had earned their respect anyway, one long, brutal, exhausting shift at a time. What would Ruth think of her now, stuck in the same tired loop, too afraid to dare ask for anything better? The next morning, Renee woke with a small new resolve sitting quietly in her chest. Instead of collapsing in front of the television during Zoe's nap like she usually did, she sat down at her wobbly kitchen table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. She wrote down every skill she could think of. Dependable, detail-oriented, good with numbers always had been, ever since grade school. Before Zoe was born, Renee had completed nearly 2 years of a bookkeeping and accounting certificate program at a local community college, and her instructors had often told her she had a natural feel for it, an ability to look at a column of numbers and simply understand what story it was trying to tell. But the pregnancy, and then the reality of raising a baby alone on a single income, had forced her to withdraw before finishing. She had never quite let go of the idea that she would go back one day. She just never seemed to find the day. She spent the next several afternoons scrolling job listings on the cracked screen of her old phone, using the thin, unreliable signal that reached her building. Most postings wanted a finished degree she did not have, or years of office experience nobody had ever given her the chance to build. The familiar tide of discouragement rose up in her more than once. But this time, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Renee pushed back against it instead of simply letting it pull her under. Meanwhile, across the city, in a quiet, glass-walled office overlooking downtown Cleveland, Malcolm Reeves found that he, too, could not stop thinking about the woman from the grocery store. His life on paper was full. Board meetings, product launches, investor calls that stretched late into the evening. A world of enormous privilege that somehow still managed to feel, most nights, deeply and unbearably lonely. His sister Diane's sudden death 3 years earlier had left a hole in his life that no amount of professional success had ever quite managed to fill. Harper was his anchor now, the reason he got out of bed some mornings at all, but raising a grieving 8-year-old while running a company that employed thousands of people had pushed him, more than once, into the easy trap of letting his staff of nannies and assistants handle the daily logistics of her childhood. Not because he loved her any less, but because being endlessly busy was simply an easier place to hide than an empty, quiet house. The image of Renee at the checkout counter stayed lodged in his mind for days. Her quiet dignity, even while being forced into an impossible choice. The fierce, protective love radiating off her as she held her daughter close. He found himself thinking about her during meetings, wondering, almost against his own will, whether she had found any of the things she seemed to be searching for. This was new territory for Malcolm. He was a man who solved problems with logic, capital, and carefully built systems, not by personally involving himself in the private lives of strangers he had met for 10 minutes in a parking lot. But Renee had not felt like a stranger. Something about her had felt oddly like a mirror. That night, while tucking Harper into bed, he lingered longer than usual, listening as she told him in great detail about a drawing she had made that day of a purple dragon with polka dot wings. He realized, with a small ache, just how many evenings like this one had slipped past him unnoticed while he was buried in spreadsheets down the hall. "Uncle Malcolm," Harper asked sleepily as he turned off her lamp, "is that lady from the store going to be okay?" The question landed harder than she probably intended. "I think she is going to be just fine, sweetheart," he said. "And I think I want to help her a little more if I can figure out how." He did not yet know exactly what that would look like. But he knew, somewhere deep and certain inside himself, that this was not something he could simply let fade away untouched. What he did not know yet, what he could not possibly have guessed standing in his niece's doorway that night, was that when he finally started looking into who Renee Coleman actually was, he would uncover a debt his own family had been quietly, unknowingly carrying for nearly 8 decades. Malcolm sat in his corner office late the following week, the glittering lights of downtown Cleveland spread out beneath him through the window, his fingers tapping absently against the edge of his desk. He wanted to help Renee, but he understood by now that he had to be careful about how. He had seen the pride flare in her eyes at that bus stop. Simply handing her a check would have insulted the very strength that had made him want to help her in the first place. So he did something he almost never did. He asked the head of his company's internal security team, a sharp, discreet former state investigator named Yolanda Price, to quietly look into some very basic background information. Nothing invasive, just enough to understand who she was. He told himself it was simple due diligence, closing a loose thread before he decided how to move forward. Somewhere underneath that explanation, though, he already knew it was something more personal than that. 2 days later, Yolanda placed a slim folder on his desk. "This is what came back on Renee Coleman, sir," she said. "Nothing unusual. Steady work history. No red flags of any kind." Malcolm opened the folder with a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. Inside were the expected things. Her address. Her employer. A clean record. And then, near the bottom of the second page, a short paragraph about her family history that made him go very still. It mentioned her great-grandmother, Ruth Coleman, a wartime steel worker at the old Lakeside Forge and Foundry on the east side of the city. Malcolm's breath caught somewhere in his throat. He knew that name and he knew that foundry. His own great-grandfather, a young floor supervisor named Walter Reeves, had worked at Lakeside Forge during the exact same period, and had spoken about it, rarely but vividly, for the rest of his long life. Malcolm remembered fragments of the story from childhood, told to him by his own father in a hushed, almost reverent voice. There had been an explosion at the foundry in the winter of 1943, a ruptured furnace line that had sent a wall of fire tearing through the casting floor in the middle of a night shift. Walter Reeves had been trapped near the collapsing scaffolding, pinned beneath a fallen support beam, the flames closing in fast. According to family legend, it was a young woman on the line, one of the new female workers brought in to fill the gaps left by men who had shipped out to war, who had pulled him free with her own 2 hands, dragging him nearly 40 feet across the burning floor to safety just moments before the section behind them collapsed entirely. Walter never forgot her name. He spoke it at Thanksgiving dinners for the rest of his life, always with the same reverence. Ruth Coleman, the woman who pulled him out of the fire. Malcolm sat back slowly in his chair, his thoughts spinning in slow, dizzying circles. This was not a coincidence. It felt, instead, like a message reaching across generations, an invisible thread finally drawing taut after 80 years of silence. He had happened by pure chance into a grocery store on an ordinary Thursday evening, and had found himself standing behind the great-granddaughter of the very woman who had once saved his own great-grandfather's life. The vague pull he had felt toward helping her hardened instantly into something far more solid. This was no longer simply an act of kindness toward a stranger. This was about honor, about legacy, about a debt his family had been unknowingly carrying since before his own father was even born. But how could he possibly repay something like that? He could not simply appear at her door with a check, an act that would cheapen the memory of what her great-grandmother had actually done. He needed to give her a real opportunity, something she could walk through under her own power, not a handout that would strip away the very dignity that made her who she was. He spent the rest of that evening lost in thought, canceling 2 meetings, letting his phone buzz unanswered on the desk in front of him. He looked at a framed photo on his shelf of himself and Harper laughing together in a park, and thought hard about the kind of man he actually wanted her to grow up believing he was. Meanwhile, across the city, Renee continued her quiet, determined search. She had sent out 9 applications in 2 weeks. 4 never responded at all. 3 turned her down for lacking a completed degree. 1 conflicted directly with Zoe's daycare hours. 1 remained stubbornly unanswered, an administrative and bookkeeping assistant position at a nonprofit organization on the near west side called the Bright Path Family Center, a place that offered support services to low-income working families and the descendants of local veterans and wartime laborers. Every night after putting Zoe to bed, Renee found herself reading more about the center's mission, and something about the work pulled at her in a way her hotel job never had, not because she looked down on that job in any way, but because this felt like it might actually be building towards something. She thought often of her great-grandmother Ruth, a woman who had walked into a foundry that did not want her there and had proven, day after grueling day, exactly what she was capable of. If working at Bright Path was even a small way to carry that same spirit forward, Renee wanted the chance badly. 3 days later, Yolanda returned to Malcolm's office with an update. Miss Coleman just applied for a position at the Bright Path Family Center, she reported. That happens to be an organization your family's foundation has quietly funded for years. Malcolm sat up straight, something sparking behind his eyes. This was exactly the opening he had been searching for. Not a direct handout, but a real earned path forward. One she could walk on her own strength while he built the support structure quietly behind her, invisible, out of sight. He knew, though, that he had to move with real care. If Renee learned the position was somehow connected to him personally, her pride would likely make her walk away from it immediately. Whatever opportunity came her way had to stand entirely on its own, judged purely on her own ability, with no trace of pity attached to it. He placed a call to the longtime executive director of the Bright Path Center, a sharp, warm, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Marsh, someone he had worked with for years through his family's charitable grants. This time, though, he was not calling about routine funding. He was calling to lay the groundwork for something considerably larger. Evelyn, he said once she picked up, I need your help building a brand new program. One aimed at the descendants of the wartime laborers and veterans in this city who never got what they were owed. Evelyn Marsh had been running the Bright Path Center for nearly 17 years. At 55, she had developed a sharp, practiced instinct for people. An ability to look past a thin resume and see the real thing sitting underneath it. When Malcolm called with his proposal, she listened carefully, tapping her pen absently against a legal pad. I want to set up a scholarship and vocational training fund, Malcolm explained. Full tuition support, child care assistance during study hours, and a modest monthly living stipend, aimed specifically at direct descendants of local wartime laborers and veterans, people whose families sacrificed enormously and were given far too little in return. That is remarkably generous, Evelyn said slowly. But Malcolm, I have to ask you directly. Does this have anything to do with Renee Coleman, who applied here just last week? There was a brief pause on the line before Malcolm answered. Yes, he admitted quietly. But I do not want her handed anything she has not genuinely earned. I want the entire selection process to be completely fair, open to any qualifying applicant in the city, judged strictly on merit and need. If she is chosen, I want it to be because of her own record, not because of me. Evelyn considered his words carefully for a long moment. All right, she finally said. But you have to promise me two things. She never learns you are behind it, not for a good while yet. And the whole process runs completely transparent, no shortcuts, no exceptions for her or for anyone. That is exactly what I want, Malcolm said, relief loosening something in his chest. A few weeks later, the program quietly launched under the name the Bright Path Opportunity Fund. Its deeper connection to the Reeves and Coleman families kept entirely out of any public materials for the time being. The fund offered full scholarships for vocational and community college coursework, along with child care support and a monthly living stipend, targeted at direct descendants of local veterans and wartime laborers living below a certain income threshold within the greater Cleveland area. When Evelyn sat down to interview Renee for the administrative assistant role a few days later, she discovered the position had unfortunately already been filled by another candidate the week before. A small, painful coincidence. But rather than letting Renee walk out the door empty-handed, Evelyn told her about the newly launched scholarship fund instead. You have some prior education in bookkeeping and accounting, is that right? Evelyn asked, scanning Renee's application. I completed almost 2 years of a certificate program before I had to leave, Renee answered, working hard to keep her voice steady even as her heart began to race. I had my daughter and I could not keep up with both. Our new fund might be able to help you finish that program, Evelyn said. But you would need to apply the same as anyone else, through a full review process, an essay, interviews, and verification of both your financial situation and your academic record. Renee nodded firmly, something hardening pleasantly in her chest. I am ready to do whatever the process requires. The application took nearly a full month to complete. Renee rewrote her essay more times than she could count, telling the story of her journey so far, of Zoe, of her great-grandmother Ruth, of a stubborn wish to build something better, not just for herself but for her daughter's future. She sat through 2 rounds of interviews with an independent review panel, none of whom had any knowledge of the connection between her family and Malcolm's. She submitted her old transcripts, which showed nearly straight top marks across her 2 years of coursework. She submitted a glowing letter of recommendation from her hotel supervisor, confirming 3 years of dependable, uncomplaining, hard work without a single unexcused absence on her record. The results arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while Renee was feeding Zoe lunch at the kitchen table. Her phone buzzed against the counter. Miss Coleman, Evelyn's voice came through, warm and clearly excited. I am so pleased to tell you that our review committee has selected you as one of the very first participants in the Bright Path Opportunity Fund. Renee had to sit down hard on the kitchen chair, her hand tightening around the phone. Truly, she asked, her voice barely holding together. Truly, Evelyn confirmed. The fund will cover your full tuition to finish your accounting certificate, plus childcare support during your class hours, and a monthly stipend generous enough that you can cut back your hotel shifts if you would like to. Tears slid freely down Renee's cheeks. This was not charity. This was a real opportunity, one she had genuinely earned through her own record and her own persistence. Who is behind this fund? She asked, unable to hold back her curiosity. Our lead donor prefers to stay anonymous for now, Evelyn said carefully. But he believes very strongly in you, based entirely on your record and your potential. After hanging up, Renee held Zoe close, tears and laughter tangled together in her chest. She thought of her great-grandmother Ruth, and of the quiet, kind stranger from the grocery store parking lot she assumed she would probably never see again. She had no idea, not yet, that these two threads of her life, one from nearly 80 years ago and one from just a few weeks earlier, were already tightly, permanently knotted together. Across the city, when Yolanda reported the good news back to him, a rare, genuine smile broke across Malcolm's face. This victory was not his. It belonged entirely to Renee, earned with her own record, her own effort, her own two hands. But the road ahead of her would not be an easy one. Balancing her hotel shifts, raising Zoe, and now evening accounting classes on top of it all would demand a level of endurance most people never have to draw on. There would be nights ahead when exhaustion nearly broke her resolve completely. But for the first time in years she had something she had never quite had before. An open door. And she intended to walk through it, no matter how steep the climb turned out to be. The first month of the program was, without question, the hardest stretch of Renee's adult life. Harder even than the night she had counted out every crumpled bill in her wallet at the checkout counter. Her new schedule began at 5 in the morning. Wake Zoe, feed her, drop her at the program's subsidized daycare near the Bright Path Center. From 8 in the morning until early afternoon. A mix of in-person and online bookkeeping coursework at the community college where she had left off 2 years earlier. Pick Zoe up by mid-afternoon, cook dinner, play, bathe her, put her to bed. Then, at 6 in the evening, back out the door for her hotel shift, finishing near 2 in the morning. By the time she finally made it home, she was lucky to sleep 4 hours before the entire cycle began again. The monthly stipend from the fund allowed her to buy a slightly newer, more reliable used car, saving her precious minutes of travel time between daycare, class, and work, minutes she genuinely could not afford to lose. There were nights she sat in the break room at the hotel between rounds of cleaning, trying desperately to force accounting formulas into a brain that felt like it was running on fumes, numbers that had once come so naturally to her now blurring together after a 2-year gap. One evening in the middle of the semester, after receiving a disappointing grade on a midterm exam, Renee sat alone in her car in the college parking lot and cried harder than she had in a very long time. She felt in that moment like she was failing not only herself, but the anonymous stranger who had believed in her enough to hand her this chance in the first place. She almost called Evelyn that night to withdraw from the program entirely. But then she thought of Zoe, asleep at home under the careful eye of a neighbor. She thought of the photograph of her great-grandmother Ruth on the bookshelf, staring steadily out of a black and white print taken nearly 80 years earlier. Ruth had not walked away from a burning factory floor. She had run straight into it to pull a stranger out. Renee was not going to let one difficult exam be the thing that finally broke her. She wiped her face, started the car, and drove home. That night, once Zoe was asleep, she opened her textbook again and studied until nearly 3 in the morning, even knowing she had only a couple of hours left before the whole exhausting cycle would start over. Renee's situation was, sadly, far from rare. Research consistently shows that single mothers in this country face poverty rates several times higher than families with 2 parents present. And for many working single mothers, the cost of specialized childcare alone can eat up nearly half of an entire paycheck, a burden that makes trying to work and study at the same time feel almost impossible for countless women exactly like her. That is precisely why the child care support built into the Bright Path Fund mattered so deeply. It was not simply a nice extra benefit. It was the single hinge on which the entire opportunity swung. The one piece that made everything else even remotely possible for a mother juggling this much at once. Slowly, gradually, things began to steady. Renee found her own rhythm inside the chaos. She formed a small study group with 2 other participants in the program, a man named Darnell training to become an electrician, and a woman named Priya studying for a medical assistant certification. The 3 of them took turns watching each other's kids on rough evenings, swapped notes, and pushed each other through the exhausted, discouraged nights that came for all of them at one point or another. Renee's grades began climbing steadily back up. She rediscovered the old familiar comfort of working with numbers, that satisfying feeling of a column finally balancing after a long search for the mistake hiding inside it. Her accounting professor singled out her final project of the semester as one of the strongest in the entire class. Zoe thrived too, in her own small way, learning new words, taking her first wobbly, determined steps across the daycare room floor. Every time Renee arrived to pick her up and watched her daughter run, arms outstretched, straight into her legs, the entire exhausting day seemed to melt away. She still thought often about the anonymous donor behind her scholarship, picturing him in her mind as an older retired veteran, someone who understood sacrifice from the inside. She wrote a long, heartfelt thank you letter and gave it to Evelyn to pass along, hoping it would find its way to him, wanting him to know his gift had landed exactly where it was meant to. She never once connected this quiet, faceless benefactor to the kind stranger from the grocery store parking lot. That memory stayed carefully tucked away in a separate corner of her heart, unrelated, she thought, to this new chapter of her life entirely. 3 months into the program, Renee received a phone call from Evelyn. "Renee dear, I have a favor to ask," the director said, her voice warm but carrying a note of gentle persuasion. "We are holding a small event next Friday evening, the official public launch of the fund, and a chance to thank the donors who made it possible. As one of our very first participants, it would mean a great deal if you could come, and perhaps say just a few words about what this opportunity has meant for you and Zoe." Renee's stomach dropped immediately. Public speaking sat near the very top of her list of fears. "Oh, Miss Evelyn, I do not know," she stammered. "I have never been good at things like that. I would not even know where to begin." "Just speak from your heart, dear," Evelyn encouraged warmly. "You are living proof of exactly why this program matters, and I understand our lead donor has agreed to attend this time as well, in person. He is an intensely private man, but I think hearing your story directly might mean more to him than anything else we could possibly say." The mention of the donor changed everything in Renee's mind instantly. This was her chance, quite possibly her only chance, to thank him face to face. The idea terrified her, but she understood, somewhere underneath the fear, that she needed to do it anyway. "All right, Miss Evelyn," she finally said, taking a slow breath. "I will come." The week leading up to the event passed in a blur of nervous energy. Renee wrote and rewrote her short speech more times than she could count, but the words never quite felt right on the page. She finally chose a simple navy dress from the clearance rack, the first new piece of clothing she had bought for herself in years. On Friday evening, she left Zoe with her trusted neighbor and drove her newer used car across town to the Bright Path Center. The event was held in the center's main hall, decorated simply with white tablecloths and small bouquets, gathering together community leaders, local veterans, and the families the center regularly served. Renee felt entirely out of place the moment she walked through the doors, gripping her small handbag tightly, scanning the room nervously for a single familiar face. Then she saw him. He stood across the room speaking with a city council member, dressed in a sharply tailored dark suit, but wearing the same thoughtful, attentive expression she remembered clearly from that parking lot months earlier. It was Malcolm, the man from the grocery store. Her heart lurched hard in her chest, a strange, tangled mix of shock and nervous excitement rising up all at once. What was he doing here? He must have felt her staring because he turned his head, and their eyes met across the crowded room. A flash of recognition crossed his face, followed almost instantly by a slow, warm smile. He excused himself from his conversation and began walking toward her, and with every step closer he took, pieces Renee had not even realized were missing began sliding rapidly into place in her mind. An anonymous lead donor. A private man rarely seen in public. A fund whose deeper story she had never fully been told. Could not possibly be. The thought felt far too much like something out of a movie. "Renee," he said warmly once he reached her. "Malcolm," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the very same question," he said, his smile widening just slightly, "though I think I can guess the answer now." At that exact moment, Evelyn hurried over, her face bright with delight. "Oh, wonderful, I see you two have already found each other," she said. "Renee, this is Malcolm Reeves. He is the person behind the Bright Path Opportunity Fund." The floor seemed to tilt gently beneath Renee's feet. She looked at Malcolm, her mouth slightly open, no sound coming out at all. It was him. The man who had bought back her daughter's milk in a dark parking lot was also the man who had quietly handed her an entire future. It had been him this whole time. "You," she finally managed to whisper, her eyes wide with disbelief. Malcolm's expression softened as he watched the storm of emotions move across her face: shock, confusion, and underneath it all, a deep and overwhelming gratitude. "Perhaps we should step outside for a few minutes," he suggested gently. "It is quieter out there." He led her through a side door into a small courtyard behind the building, where the cool night air offered an unexpected sense of relief. The faint sound of music and conversation drifting out through the door left open behind them. "I do not understand," Renee said, her voice still trembling. "Why would you do all of this for me?" Malcolm leaned back against the brick wall, hands tucked into his pockets, looking up briefly at the clear night sky before turning his gaze back to her. "It is a long story, Renee," he said quietly, "but it actually started a long time ago, well before either one of us was even born." For the rest of that evening, standing together in the cool courtyard, he told her everything. About his great-grandfather Walter Reeves, and the terrible fire at the old lakeside forge and foundry in the winter of 1943. About a young woman on the casting floor who had dragged a trapped, badly injured stranger nearly 40 feet across a burning factory floor to safety, moments before the section behind them both collapsed completely. "That woman's name was in your family Bible long before it ever showed up in mine," Malcolm said, his voice low and full of feeling. "My great-grandfather spoke her name at every single Thanksgiving for the rest of his life. Ruth Coleman, the woman who pulled him out of the fire." Renee listened, utterly absorbed, feeling every trace of shame or obligation dissolve completely inside her. This was not pity. This was something closer to sacred, a bond forged decades earlier in fire and courage, echoing forward across time to quietly reshape her life today. "All my life, I only ever knew her from that one photograph," Renee said, her voice thick with tears she had not yet let fall. "She was just a face on the bookshelf, a family legend nobody could fully explain. You made her real to me tonight. Thank you. You are the one carrying her legacy forward now," Renee, Malcolm said, his voice sincere. "You finishing this program, building a future for you and Zoe, that is the truest way anyone could ever honor what she did." A comfortable silence settled between them. For the first time, Renee no longer felt intimidated standing beside him. She did not see a billionaire anymore. She saw the great-grandson of a man her own great-grandmother had once saved, doing his very best to finally settle an old quiet debt. "I should go back inside," Renee finally said, taking a steadying breath. "I think it is almost time for me to give my speech." The thought terrified her all over again, in an entirely new way now. "You are going to do wonderfully," Malcolm said, his eyes steady and encouraging. "Just speak from your heart. That is genuinely all anyone in that room needs to hear tonight." He was right. When Renee stepped up to the small podium a few minutes later and looked out over the modest crowd, she did not see a room full of strangers anymore. She saw her great-grandmother's legacy standing behind her. She saw Zoe's future stretched out ahead of her. And in the front row she saw Malcolm, his eyes carrying a calm, steady support that gave her exactly the strength she needed to begin speaking. The carefully written speech she had rehearsed all week seemed to dissolve completely from her mind the moment she opened her mouth. The polished sentences fell away, leaving only the raw, unpolished truth of her own journey. She did not speak as a scholarship recipient that night. She spoke as a mother. She told the room about the exhausting weight of raising a child completely alone. She told them about the shame she had felt at a grocery register months earlier, forced to choose between her daughter's needs and the few dollars sitting in her wallet. She spoke about her great-grandmother, not as a distant name on an old photograph, but as a woman whose fierce courage she found herself reaching for on her hardest, most exhausted nights. "This scholarship," she said, her eyes finding Malcolm's across the crowded room, "is not simply financial help. It is a message. It tells us that we are seen. It tells us that the sacrifices our grandmothers and great-grandmothers made were never forgotten, no matter how many years passed in between. It tells us that their courage does not just sit carved into an old photograph somewhere. It lives on, right now, in the doors their descendants finally get to walk through." She closed with simple words. "Thank you for giving my daughter a future. And thank you for giving me back my hope." When she stepped away from the podium, the room sat in stunned silence for a long beat, before warm, genuine applause rose up around her. A few older veterans in the crowd wiped quietly at their eyes. As Renee made her way back to her seat, her legs still shaking beneath her, person after person reached out to shake her hand, to thank her for her honesty, to tell her how deeply her words had landed. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like an outsider standing awkwardly at the edge of a room. She felt instead like she genuinely belonged there. Malcolm was waiting for her when she sat back down, his eyes bright with an emotion she could not quite name. It looked more than anything like pride. "I told you that you would do wonderfully," he murmured, quiet enough for only her to hear. Across the room, Patricia Vance, 47 years old, a longtime member of the Center's board and a close friend of Malcolm's late sister Diane, watched the entire exchange with a noticeably cooler expression settling over her face. She saw the warmth in Malcolm's eyes as he looked at Renee, a warmth she had not seen him show toward anyone since Diane's death 3 years earlier. She saw the genuine respect and admiration Renee had just earned from every community leader in the room. In Patricia's carefully ordered world, where status and pedigree mattered a great deal, Renee Coleman was an unexpected disruption, something that did not fit neatly into the picture she had long assumed for Malcolm's future. And Patricia was not a woman who tolerated disruption easily. Over the following weeks, a quiet, corrosive campaign began to spread through the Center's board of directors, subtle enough that no single comment on its own sounded like an accusation. Patricia, a skilled operator within that particular social circle, never attacked Renee directly. Her method was far more careful than that. During a routine budget review meeting, she sighed and remarked, "I am simply a little concerned about the oversight of this new fund. It seems like a very large amount of money has gone to one individual, based on what appears to be a personal connection." In the hallways afterward, she lowered her voice as though sharing a private worry with each board member individually. "It is a lovely story, of course, but we do need to think carefully about public perception here. We would not want anyone to assume donations are being funneled toward a personal favorite." The implication landed exactly as cruelly as she intended it to. Renee was not, in this telling, a deserving scholarship recipient at all, but rather the object of Malcolm's pity or worse, of some inappropriate personal interest. She was framed without ever being named outright, as someone who had somehow manipulated a grieving lonely billionaire. And Malcolm, still working through his own grief over Diane, was recast as a man being taken advantage of, using charitable funds to pursue a woman he barely knew. The story was ugly, distorted, and deeply damaging, and it spread through the board with uncomfortable speed. Evelyn, who had defended Renee and the program fiercely from the start, tried to stop the rumors before they could take further root, but Patricia's influence among the Center's other donors and board members proved too strong to fully contain. Eventually, Evelyn had no choice but to call a formal board meeting to review the entire scholarship allocation process, and by implication its very future. She called Renee the evening before the meeting, her voice heavy with worry. "I am so sorry, Renee," she said. "Patricia Vance is questioning the transparency of the whole fund. She wants to suspend it pending a full review, and I am afraid she has enough support on the board to actually pull it off." A cold weight settled through Renee's chest as she listened. The new life she had spent months carefully rebuilding, one exhausting, sleepless night at a time, suddenly felt like it might collapse out from under her without warning. The shame and humiliation buried inside Patricia's insinuations struck her almost like a physical blow. But underneath that fear, another feeling rose up to meet it, hot and unmistakable. Anger. This was not only about her anymore. Patricia was quietly tarnishing the memory of her great-grandmother and threatening to destroy an opportunity that could still help countless other families exactly like her own. The Renee from a year earlier might have simply absorbed this blow and quietly disappeared back into the background. But the Renee sitting in that kitchen tonight, the woman who had rediscovered her own voice over the past several months, was not going to back down without putting up a fight first. "When is the meeting?" she asked, her voice surprising even herself with how steady it came out. The next afternoon, Renee walked into the Bright Path boardroom with her spine straight and her chin level, even as her stomach churned violently underneath her composed exterior. Every head in the room turned toward her the moment she stepped through the door. Patricia sat at the head of the long conference table, her face flickering briefly with surprise and clear displeasure at Renee's unexpected appearance. Malcolm sat near the far end, his jaw tight, his expression carefully controlled but unmistakably tense. Patricia opened the meeting smoothly, speaking at length about fiduciary responsibility, about donor confidence, about the importance of procedures that could withstand any level of outside scrutiny. She never once said Renee's name directly, but everyone seated around that table understood exactly who she meant. What I would like to propose, Patricia concluded, glancing around the table with an expression of carefully manufactured concern, is that we pause this particular initiative until a more rigorous, more clearly independent selection process can be put in place. This is simply a matter of sound governance, nothing personal at all. A heavy silence settled over the room. The other board members exchanged uncertain glances, decent people, most of them, but clearly wary of pushing back against Patricia's considerable standing within the city's donor community. Before anyone else could speak, Renee rose slowly to her feet. "My name is Renee Coleman," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the quiet room. "I am the individual Miss Vance seems so concerned about." She turned to look directly at Patricia. "You keep talking about process and governance, but what you are actually doing is trying to punish me because you have decided, without ever once speaking to me, that I am not worthy of this opportunity. You look at me and you see a hotel housekeeper, and you assume that tells you everything you need to know about who I am. But the work a person does in order to feed their child has never once told the whole story of their worth. You see a charity case standing here. You do not see a great-granddaughter trying, in her own small way, to honor a legacy of courage." She turned to address the rest of the board directly. "This fund is not only about me. It is for every family in this city who has sacrificed and been forgotten. It is for every child whose grandmother or great-grandmother gave something enormous and never received real recognition for it. If we suspend this program, bury it in endless review committees simply because one person disagrees with the very first recipient, that decision insults every single family like mine." Patricia let out a small, dismissive scoff. "That is a very moving speech, Miss Coleman, but it does not change the underlying facts. You already had a personal relationship with our lead donor before this fund even existed. However you want to frame that, the appearance of it at the very least is deeply inappropriate. You are right about one thing." A deep, calm voice came from the far end of the table. Malcolm rose slowly to his feet. "Our two families really do share a prior relationship," he said. "That relationship happens to go back more than 80 years. He walked to the head of the table and set down a worn, leather-bound journal, already open to a marked page. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," he said to the now visibly stunned board members. "Walter Reeves. In it, he wrote in detail about the night his life was saved, during a fire at the Lakeside Forge and Foundry, by a young woman on the casting floor named Ruth Coleman." His finger traced slowly along a faded line of ink. "He wrote here, and I am reading this exactly as he wrote it, that she was the bravest person he ever knew in his entire life, and that he owed her a debt he could never fully repay." Malcolm laid out several more items on the polished table. A faded photograph of a group of young factory workers, his great-grandfather standing among them beside a young woman who was, unmistakably, Ruth Coleman. A commendation letter from the foundry's owner, praising her actions that night, though history, as it so often did for women and workers of color during that era, had quietly failed to give her the wider recognition her courage actually deserved. "The Bright Path Opportunity Fund is not an act of charity," Malcolm said, his voice carrying real weight and conviction. "It is a long overdue debt of honor, finally being repaid by the Reeves family to the Coleman family. Renee Coleman is not the object of my pity. She is the direct heir to an act of courage my own family has a sacred obligation to remember and repay. Anyone in this room who suggests otherwise is disrespecting the memory of both of these two people." The room fell into complete, total silence. Patricia's face went pale. The carefully constructed narrative she had spent weeks building collapsing instantly under the weight of an actual, undeniable history. She had attacked with insinuation and vague concern. Malcolm had answered with documented truth and honor. There was simply nothing left for her to say. The board voted unanimously, not only to continue the scholarship fund exactly as it stood, but to expand it significantly, partnering formally with Malcolm's Family Foundation to make it a permanent, protected pillar of the center's mission going forward. Renee felt an enormous wave of relief wash through her. But underneath that relief, something still felt slightly unfinished to her. The battle that day had been won largely on the strength of Malcolm's family story, his documented history, his considerable standing in the room. She wanted the process itself to be genuinely fair going forward, resting on a transparent system anyone could trust completely, not dependent on one family's dramatic history to survive a challenge. A week after the board meeting, Renee arranged to meet Malcolm at a small coffee shop near the center, while Zoe played happily nearby in the children's corner. "I am relieved the fund is continuing," she said, stirring her coffee slowly. "But I cannot stop thinking about what almost happened." "What is on your mind?" Malcolm asked, watching her carefully. "Miss Vance was wrong about me," Renee said. "But she was not entirely wrong about one thing. My story survived because you had a powerful enough story of your own to defend it. But what happens with the next participant, someone who is just as deserving, but does not happen to have a dramatic 80-year-old connection sitting behind them to protect them if someone decides to attack them the same way?" Malcolm sat quietly for a long moment, recognizing clearly that she had identified something he had not fully considered on his own. "You are right," he finally said. "I defended this program with my family's history. But a truly fair program should never need a moving story just to survive a challenge. It needs to stand on the strength of its own process, full stop." Over the following months, Malcolm worked closely with Evelyn and a newly formed, fully independent oversight committee made up of local educators, veterans, and community finance experts to rebuild the fund's entire governance structure from the ground up. Selection criteria were published openly on the center's website. Review panels rotated on a strict annual basis to prevent any long-term bias from taking root. An oversight board with absolutely no direct connection to the Reeves family was established to review and approve every single scholarship decision going forward. Malcolm also chose to make the full story of the connection between the two families public, not to seek any praise for himself, but specifically to ensure that no one could ever again use it as a private weapon against a future recipient the way Patricia had tried to use it against Renee. Transparency, he realized clearly now, was the strongest form of protection he could possibly offer the program. Patricia Vance quietly resigned from the board less than 2 weeks later. Nobody on the board raised any objection to her departure. Renee, meanwhile, continued her studies with a renewed and unshakable sense of purpose, ultimately completing her accounting certificate at the top of her graduating class. Somewhere along the way, she realized she did not only love working with numbers. She had also come to love the process of helping other people find their own footing. She spent countless extra hours volunteering at the Bright Path Center, guiding new program participants, sharing her own hard-won experience of balancing work, study, and raising a child completely alone. When she finally graduated, she received a strong job offer from a respected accounting firm downtown, a salary nearly 3 times what she had been earning as a housekeeper. But she also received a second offer, this one from Evelyn, for the position of Scholarship Program Coordinator at the Bright Path Center itself, a role that would let her directly guide families walking the same difficult road she had just finished walking herself. This decision was entirely her own, something Malcolm never once tried to influence. "Whatever path you choose," he told her simply, "I believe it will be the right one because it is going to be your choice, not mine." After several nights of careful thought, Renee chose the position at the Bright Path Center. The salary was considerably lower than the private firm's offer, but the meaning behind the work mattered far more to her than any number on a paycheck ever could. She wanted to become, for someone else, exactly the kind of open door that had once been offered to her. 2 years passed, and by the end of them, nearly everything in Renee's life had changed completely. On a warm Saturday afternoon, she and Malcolm sat together on a large blanket spread out across the wide green lawn of a downtown park. A short distance away, Harper, now 10 years old, and Zoe, now 3, chased each other in wide, delighted circles, their laughter carrying clearly across the open grass, the two of them looking in that moment like nothing so much as real sisters. The relationship between Renee and Malcolm had grown slowly and naturally over those 2 years, built not on grand romantic gestures, but on a steady foundation of shared values, mutual respect, and a quiet, deep understanding neither of them had expected to find again in their lives. He had become, without either of them planning it exactly, someone she trusted completely, someone she now simply thought of as family. "You know," Renee said, watching Zoe chase a butterfly across the grass, "I still think about that woman at the checkout counter sometimes. So lost. So afraid of everything." Malcolm slid an arm around her, pulling her gently closer against his side. "I think about her too," he said quietly. "And about the man standing a few feet away, who had gotten so lonely by then that he had almost forgotten what real connection was supposed to feel like. He looked from the two laughing girls back to the calm, confident, deeply steady woman sitting beside him now. You did not just build a new life for yourself, Renee. You rebuilt mine right along with it. You reminded me what legacy is actually supposed to mean. Not the size of the number left behind, but the number of lives it genuinely touched along the way. She turned and smiled at him, a smile carrying the same steady, genuine warmth as the debt of honor their two great-grandparents had unknowingly built between their families all those decades earlier. Then Renee stood up, walked over and sat down between the two girls on the grass. She pulled a small box out of her bag. Not a carton of specialty milk this time, but a set of colored pencils, a small gift she had picked up earlier that week for both of them. She sat between Harper and Zoe, drawing quietly alongside them, laughing at their silly pictures, needing no grand check, no sweeping gesture, only the simple, complete gift of her full attention given freely to two children she loved. That, in the end, was exactly what this entire long journey had taught both of them. That real kindness never lives in the size of the gift given. It lives in whether you actually take the time to truly see another person standing in front of you. That the work a person does to survive, whether scrubbing hotel bathrooms at midnight or running a $2 billion company by daylight, never once defines their real worth. And that for the children we love, no gift, no matter how expensive, will ever replace the simple, steady gift of genuine presence. The whole journey had begun with something entirely unplanned, forged slowly through hardship, and eventually through grace. But here under the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the easy, quiet joy of the family they had somehow built together without ever quite meaning to, Renee understood, clearly and completely, that they had finally landed exactly where they were always meant to be. It all began with one small act of kindness inside an ordinary grocery store on an ordinary Thursday evening, proof, if anyone still needed it, that a debt of honor never truly expires, and that the quietest acts of love, offered without any expectation of return, always echo the loudest across generations. Thank you for staying with me through the entire story of Renee and Malcolm. Renee Coleman, Malcolm Reeves, the Bright Path Family Center. Every name in this story was written for you tonight. Entirely fictional. But the fear that sat in Renee's chest at that checkout counter, the quiet arithmetic of counting bills against a total that will not move, that part is not fiction at all. Somewhere out there tonight, there is still a mother doing that exact same math in her head, standing in a checkout line, hoping the total lands differently this time. There is still a night shift worker who has gone years without ever once feeling truly seen by another person. I think about this every time I pass a store lit up in the dark, and catch a glimpse of someone standing alone under the fluorescent lights, doing quiet math nobody else can see. May someone always see you, no matter what hard season of life you happen to be walking through right now. And may you, one day, become the person who makes somebody else feel like they are not invisible after all. If this story reached something in you tonight, tap that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one, and share it with somebody who has been on your mind lately. I will see you in the next story.
Moral of the story: kindness is not measured by how much money we give, but by how deeply we see and respect another person's humanity. Malcolm had more wealth than he could ever spend, but his most meaningful act was simply noticing a struggling mother and helping her without humiliating her. Renee's journey also teaches us that receiving help does not mean giving up our dignity. Sometimes one opportunity is all a determined person needs to rebuild their life. The story reminds us that our actions can create ripples that last for generations. We should never judge someone by their job, appearance, or financial situation, because every person carries struggles and potential that we may never see. Most importantly, kindness, courage, and opportunity can transform lives. And when we receive those gifts, the greatest way to honor them is to pass them on to someone else.